Hi everybody, welcome back to Bethenaeum. My name is Ellie Marie and today we are going to talk about world building. Alright, so for a lot of people, world building is the same as plot and they don't understand why I do 1 week on plotting and 1 week on world building. So today we're going to take a look at some of the basics that make up this idea of world building versus plot. And we are going to do kind of a lead into the video for later this week where we look at some of the basics of how you can work on constructing your own world for your current work. One thing to keep in mind while we look at world building is that world building looks different for different authors depending upon the setting of their story. So if you have your story is set in current times, modern times, your world building is going to be a lot easier than if you are writing like a high fantasy piece where you have to develop a world more or less from scratch, including maps and locations and geography. And that can get way more complicated than if you are setting something that is like modern times and on Earth. So that's something to keep in mind in case you're sitting here thinking to yourself, but Ellie Marie, I'm writing a detective novel. I don't really need to know anything about designing maps or about designing geography or about naming places because my stuff all takes place in Boston, Massachusetts. And that's fine. That just means that world building is a smaller component of your particular piece versus someone else's piece who might be writing, like I said before, a high fantasy, in which the case they need to be looking at all of those elements. They need to be looking at geography, capitals, cities, towns, all of that stuff. And that is all encompassed in world building. All right, world building versus plot. So we talked about plot last week. Plot is the story arcs, the adventure, the character changes. Plot is a lot of things in your story. Plot is your story, much like characters are your story. You can't have a story without characters, just like you can't have a story without plot. Now, at the same time, you really can't have a story without setting. However, you can write a story that has characters and plot while the setting is somewhat ambiguous. Now, this can take away from your story or it can lend to your story depending on what kind of story it is you're looking to write. But for what we're looking at today, we're just going to assume that setting is important to your work and therefore that you need to put some time and energy into world building for your novel. So, like we established last week, plot is the story and the changes that happen to your characters. It follows that story arc like we talked about. If you haven't seen that yet, I will link to it below so that you can go ahead and take a look at both of those videos. We've got 2 of them, and you can follow along with our definition of plot. So what does that make world building? World building is going to be more like the setting, the characters, place and where they live, where they commute, where they build their lives. That's going to be your setting. So let's take a brief look at some of the possible settings that you could put your novel in. As I've already stated, world building does highly depend on what kind of story it is you're writing. So let's take a look at setting a modern on Earth piece, in which case world building and setting building is going to be a bit easier. If your novel is set modern times, current places, one of the things you're really going to have to do for your world building, and this is going to take up most of your time, is research. Because if you are setting your story in a real place where real people live, people are going to call you out on your inaccuracies. They are, because they live there and they know the place like the back of their hand. And so it's really important that if you are, say for example, setting your story in modern day Boston, Massachusetts, you need to do the research, and it's even better if you can manage to visit. If you can visit the place, get a feel for the location, figure out what kind of places are around that maybe the internet won't tell you about. Those are the little things that will breathe a little bit more life into your setting and make your story a little bit more believable. So if you are setting your story in a place that does already exist, you are going to need to do a little bit of work into your setting and your world building, and that is going to involve research and maybe visiting if you can accomplish that, because it just adds that extra layer to your story of believability, and it helps the reader stay immersed in following your plot. But what if your story is a high fantasy and you need to build a whole new world that you can't just go research? One of the things that I suggest for that, and I'm going to get into it more in the video that's coming out later this week. If you're watching this in the future, I'm sure you can go on out and find it. It'll be the second video to come out about plotting in our NaNoWriMo Chronicles series. And the thing that I suggest is to pick something to base your setting on. Pick something that actually exists that you can go research to base your setting on. And my example that I'm going to be using for this for you all is my NaNoWriMo work from last year, and it's Among the Sands. And basically what I did was I started with a map, and we'll talk about maps as well in the next video. And I picked cultures that I felt would really blend well, that already existed, with some of the structural ideas of their society that I had already decided on. Things that I already knew were going to impact the characters, that I already knew were going to impact the story flow, like their religious beliefs and that sort of thing. I chose groups of people and places that already exist in our world that I could do research on, and then kind of meld together and alter a little bit to create something new to help bolster that and make it feel richer and more real. Now, just as an example from my work Among the Sands, the primary clan that the story focuses around, they are heavily centered and based on a lot of Native American culture and social things. I kind of took those things, such as their reverence for Mother Nature, their ideas of how they're connected to their land, and all of that kind of stuff. I took kind of those basic ideas and I helped to incorporate them into their culture. I also took some culture stuff from the Middle East and I kind of blended them together. I primarily picked those two groups because they can blend together well in the ways that I was pulling from them, and because the culture that I was developing for my story, they live in the desert. And so I tried really hard to look at some of the cultures that I know have lived in deserted areas, such as the Middle East and the kind of far west, Midwest portion of the United States. Now, that's not to say that all of the cultures in my book are based on those two. I have multiple cultures kind of developing in that particular story. And so I also pull from some other groups. I have one culture that's loosely based on the Mongolians and another culture that's loosely based on the Aztecs and the Mayas and the Incas. So it's pulling from all of these different cultures, but try to do so tastefully. Don't like take the stereotypic understanding of this culture and say, well, that's my culture, because that's not really world building. That's just stealing somebody's culture, and that's not appropriate or acceptable. So do your best to really do your research on what those cultures really were like, and not just what popular culture would maybe define them as, and then pull the essence from that. Don't just blindly grab from cultures. Try really hard to really delve into those cultures and to try to build something from that. And I know that I'm talking a lot about culture and not like geography. We will get into geography more in the next video. Culture is the part of the setting that is most important. You can talk all you want about the mountains, and you can talk all you want about the prairies and the whatever is going on geography wise in your story, but if you do not understand your culture within your story, if it's not set here in one that is actually in existence, it will come out. And that will be the biggest thing with the setting and with the location that your readers will miss. And they will say something about it. They will be like, well, but you said this, but then they did this. And because you don't have set understandings of what that culture looks like. So world building is actually really complicated, and it's going to be really hard to fit all of it into 2 videos covering 1 week, but I'm going to really try, and we're going to get into a lot more of the details in the next video. But I did kind of want to touch at least basically on a definition and an understanding of what world building is. So world building is not your story. World building is not your plot. It's not your story arc. World building is going to be your location, your geography, and your culture. And of the 3 of those, the culture that your story is taking place in, or cultures, if there's more than one, is the most important element, because that is what the people live in. You can pick up a group of people and put them in a different physical location, but their culture will be the same because their religious beliefs, their social beliefs, all of that will be the same. Make sure you pay attention to those three things, but the big one I would like to stress that you will need to put a lot of work into for world building is going to be culture and social understanding. So I know that that was a lot of information and that it was probably really complicated, and I'm sorry. It's a lot, and I'm trying to work it into 2 videos and not just like overwhelm you with information in one like super long 20-minute video. So hopefully you kind of understood what I was getting at with this week's video, and hopefully I did so appropriately without just telling you to go out and steal people's culture, because you shouldn't do that, and it is inappropriate to steal other people's culture just so that you can write a story. Make sure you are being tasteful and you are being respectful of people's culture when you are researching and when you are developing one for your work. And with that being said, I would like to thank you for joining us today. And if you enjoyed this video, I'd like to ask you to subscribe and ring that little bell so that you get notifications when I upload new videos, which is every Tuesday and Friday. Or you can come on over to Bethenaeum.com and check me out on my blog there. And as always, thank you for your time, and I appreciate you. Bye.